top U.S. general may have talked to China behind President Trump's back. China threatens to send warships near Hawaii, and Biden can't get Xi Jinping to meet with him. That and more on this week's China News Headline. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell, and we have a bombshell of a story this week. Media are saying the U.S.'s top general, Mark Milley, went behind President Trump's back to have secret conversations with China. According to the book, Milley made two calls to the Chinese general, one in October 2020 and one in January 2021. In one conversation, Milley told Lee that he would alert him in the event of a U.S. attack. So did Milley secretly go behind President Trump's back and speak with a Chinese general off the books? On one hand, one of the authors of the book making that claim is Bob Woodward. He's a longtime journalist who exposed the Nixon-Watergate scandal in the 1970s. On the other hand, there are a lot of controversies about Woodward's methods of reporting, including allegations that when writing past books, he hid important context or even completely made up facts to fit a narrative. Some people are saying if the book is accurate, what Milley did was treason. It's not. Treason is a very specific thing. However, there are certainly calls for him being fired or discharged from the military. Milley is standing behind his communications with China. His spokesman said in a statement that those communications weren't secret. They were part of his regular communications with defense chiefs worldwide, including China and Russia. Meanwhile, other U.S. officials are also saying those calls were not secret. According to Fox News, multiple people were in the room for both calls, which were also coordinated with the Defense Secretary's office. And Axios is reporting that Defense Secretary Mark Esper was involved as well. According to their sources, in mid-October 2020, top Pentagon officials grew concerned about intelligence they'd seen. It showed the Chinese were consuming their own intelligence that had made them concerned about the possibility of a surprise U.S. strike against China. One of the sources said, "I think the Chinese were getting bad intelligence, a combination of wag-the-dog conspiracy thinking and bad intel from bad sources." Defense Secretary Esper was concerned this bad intelligence could lead to Chinese authorities misreading the situation and getting into a military conflict with the U.S. So, Esper directed his policy office to issue a back-channel message to the Chinese to reassure them the U.S. had no intention of seeking a military confrontation. And according to Axios' sources, Milley called his Chinese counterpart to reiterate Esper's message. Axios says it's unclear whether Trump knew this was going on. Fox News also confirmed Axios' report about the Pentagon's concern that China was getting bad intelligence. More information is likely to come out in the next few days, but it looks like this story is more complicated than initial reports. The book Peril portrays Milley's calls to China as necessary because of how dangerous Trump was. But as a consequence of that portrayal, the authors made Milley look unethical. And it seems like the Pentagon was concerned too, but not related to anything Trump did. The Pentagon was concerned about Chinese leaders getting bad intelligence that could lead to an accidental military conflict. More after the break. Welcome back. So personally, I'm glad General Milley took the time to reassure China that the U.S. wouldn't attack, because China is not doing the same. My favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, is warning that Chinese warships will soon sail near Hawaii. Basically, you know how the U.S. conducts freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea? Well, as the editor of the Global Times says, hopefully when Chinese warships pass through the Caribbean Sea or show up near Hawaii and Guam one day, the U.S. will uphold the same standard of freedom of navigation. That day will come soon. A perfect example of communist propaganda. It may sound reasonable on the surface, but it's actually quite stupid. The U.S. does not conduct freedom of navigation operations next to China's Hainan Island. That's Chinese territorial waters, the way the waters off the coast of Hawaii are U.S. territorial waters. What the U.S. does is send warships through the South China Sea. That's because China claims basically the entire South China Sea, even though that area has not historically been part of China's territory. But the Chinese regime says otherwise. They use their claims as an excuse to constantly harass their neighbors, sending in ships or fighter jets into those countries' territorial waters. And to further stake a claim, over the past decade, they've built artificial islands there and put missile launchers on them. The only thing keeping China from completely taking over is the presence of the U.S. military, reminding everyone that, hey, these are international waters. So remember back in February 2020, when the prestigious medical journal The Lancet published this letter from 27 concerned scientists who said, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." That basically killed any conversation about the lab leak hypothesis for about a year. Of course, we now know that letter was spearheaded by Dr. Peter Daszak. He actually gave U.S. taxpayer money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study coronaviruses, which, was a major conflict of interest, which he didn't disclose in that letter. Actually, all the scientists who signed off on that letter said, "We declare no competing interests." Well, guess what? 26 of the 27 scientists who signed that letter have links to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I wonder why some people in the scientific community don't want an investigation into the lab leak hypothesis. A prominent Chinese defector tried to warn U.S. intelligence agencies about the coronavirus in November 2019. I wonder if they listened. Wei Jingsheng is sometimes called the father of China's democracy movement. In his new book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, he says he first heard about a mysterious new virus in October 2019, during the World Military Games in Wuhan. People were getting some kind of strange respiratory illness. I wonder what it could have been. When asked whether intelligence agencies took him seriously, he said, "I felt they were not as heavily concerned as I was, so I tried my best to provide more detailed information. They may not believe there is a government of a country that would do something like that, cover up a virus." Well, of course not. Accusing the Chinese government of covering up a virus is xenophobic. Speaking of astounding ignorance about China, Google. Google disclosed times it provided user data to Hong Kong authorities, even though it said last year it was going to stop. Now, according to Google, they only gave user data to Hong Kong authorities 3 times after they said they wouldn't. Those requests involved a credible threat to someone's life and 2 other cases involving human trafficking. According to the company's terms of service, which applies globally, Google is allowed to provide information in such cases. Perfect! Now Hong Kong authorities know just what they need to tell Google to get them to hand over user info. Yeah, these democracy activists are dangerous terrorists who are threatening people's lives. Wait, actually they're already saying that. Never mind. Stanford University professors are calling for an end to the Trump-era China initiative, calling it racial profiling. Critics say it targets an entire ethnic group, which is inaccurate. It never targeted ethnically Chinese students or professors in the U.S. It targets students from Chinese military-linked universities studying in the U.S. in fields that could be a threat to national security, or professors who are doing research with those universities. But that hasn't stopped members of Congress from trying to end the program. Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly turned down President Biden's suggestion to meet in person. But now Biden is denying those reports. I mean, come on, man, this is China we're talking about, not North Korea. And just so you know, there are people saying Biden should end the North Korea travel ban, because Americans have had such lovely times in North Korea. Has the whole world gone stupid? Anyway, Biden's invitation to meet with Xi supposedly came up on a phone call they had last week. Biden says that's not what happened, but he might not be telling the truth. A source who was among those briefed on the call confirmed the report was accurate. She apparently intimated that the tone and atmosphere of the relationship needed to be improved first before he would agree to meet in person. It's almost like dictators don't want to talk to Biden. I can relate. Xi Jinping still hasn't responded to any of my faxes. Someday, I'm going to get that interview. Someday. Wikipedia has banned 7 mainland Chinese users. According to Hong Kong Free Press, Wikipedia has taken unprecedented action to ban 7 mainland Chinese users from its websites globally and revoke administrator access and other privileges for 12 other users, following an HKFP report of alleged threats to Hong Kong users. Things are really not going great for Hong Kong. Will Taiwan be able to avoid its fate? More after the break. Welcome back. According to Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu, Taiwan is a sea fortress, baby. And yes, he said baby. Probably. Taiwan is a sea fortress, blocking China's expansion into the Pacific, and is willing to share with other democracies its knowledge of countering Beijing's efforts to undermine it. Baby. Taiwan is wrangling for some international recognition. Most countries don't have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan because China won't allow it. Taiwan has been excluded from the World Health Organization even during the pandemic. However, as I mentioned in an episode earlier this week, Taiwan is getting more support from other countries, and offering up some sweet intelligence on Beijing's influence operations might be pretty tasty to any country the Chinese Communist Party is trying to undermine, which is every country. In a sign we've learned nothing from the pandemic, U.S. mask makers say they are being clobbered by cheaper competition from China. When the pandemic began, the U.S. had a severe shortage of masks and other medical equipment because China makes pretty much all of it. And that's because China had driven all the American manufacturers out of business by making everything cheaper. Of course, with the pandemic, demand went through the roof. The U.S. began making masks again. And now, the cycle repeats itself. If you'd like to learn more about how China took over the medical mask supply, check out our podcast with Mike Bowen, the co-owner of U.S. mask maker Prestige Ameritech, a major U.S. medical supplier. He tried to warn the government for 15 years about what was coming. I wonder if they listened. And now it's time for me to answer a question from a member of the China Uncensored 50 Cent Army, a viewer who supports our channel on the crowdfunding website Patreon and Locals. Ringleader asks, "Hey Chris, when the next CCP elections take place, what will happen if Xi doesn't get a third term? Who would replace him, and would it be a smooth transition or a violent one?" Well, I wouldn't exactly call them elections, at least not as we know them in democratic societies. But next year will be the 20th Party Congress. It's the biggest meeting of top communist officials. Happens every 5 years. They do things like lay out the next 5-year plan for the economy. Because yes, China is still communist and has a state-planned economy. Now, during the last meeting, Xi removed term limits, so theoretically, he could rule indefinitely. The reality is more complicated. Mao ruled till he died. Deng Xiaoping basically controlled things until he died. Jiang Zemin was technically head of the party from 1989 to 2002. The only Chinese leader to have 2 5-year terms and then fully step down was Hu Jintao. So it's weird how everyone talks about it like Xi is somehow breaking precedent. But whether Xi can get that third term depends on how much personal power he has over the party. There are definitely plenty of factions in the Communist Party, and many, like the faction tied to former leader Jiang Zemin, would love to see Xi ousted. Some of those guys even tried to stage a coup when Xi first came to power. If Xi doesn't take a third term, there's been some talk floating around about Wang Yang replacing him. He's on the Politburo Standing Committee and is the head of the CPPCC. But violence is always possible. There's been a long history of that in the Communist Party. Xi might have to assert his claim to power by purging more of his opponents, or his opponents may try to force him out. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for your question and your support, Ringleader. And a big thank you to everyone who's joining us in the fight to expose the Chinese Communist Party to the world. Making the show is hard, what with YouTube censorship and demonetization, and the fact that most advertisers aren't brave enough to work with us. So we rely on your support. You can join over at patreon.com/China Uncensored or ChinaUncensored.locals.com. You get different perks with each, so check them out. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.